last time I was here, Father Jerry was on vacation. And that's why I was here. And I'm here again. But it's always good I love going to new parishes or different parishes or visiting. I'm retired now because my back doesn't work like it used to, and I fall easily. I just love being old. I get dizzy, bowing before the altar there, I had to keep my eyes open because if I close my eyes, I'm like going everywhere. It's just part of the aging process, and like it or not, you have to deal with those realities. And it's not so bad when you get to do that because, when I turned 70 back in March, I was like, how did I get here? What happened in between? The last time I thought about it, I was like in my 40s, and it was like life wasn't so bad in those days. But then it just keeps on moving along. And again, that's part of the reality of life. You have to deal with it. You cannot ignore it. That's part of the existence of being a human being. And so when miraculous things happen, and they do happen, we're always taken aback. We're a little shocked. I know Elvira's in the hospital and needs our prayer. And prayer can heal. It can restore people to life. I used to be chaplain up in Carroll County at Carroll County Hospital and worked in the parish on the weekends and at night. And, it's like back in the days when you worked 24/7. And I got a call from one of the nurses at Dove House. Dove House is the hospice program connected to the hospital up there. It's separate, but it's connected to a new facility. Quite nice. So the nurse called me, and I had been going there for quite a while, so she knew me, I knew her. And she gives you the code, actively dying, which means get your butt here as quickly as you can. And so I did. It was a Saturday morning, and I walked to the nurse's station, and I said, I'm here for so-and-so, and she's in her room. We don't know what kind of condition she might be in when you get there. Okay, it's fine. It's nothing. It's what you do as a chaplain. You go into, many a time before I went into a hospital room, I would pray to the Lord, Lord, let my words be your words. Let your words be my words, because I didn't know what to say to the person on the other side of that door who was going through crisis. So I walked in. This woman was 85. She had retired. Her and her husband retired to Florida. He died there. She only had nieces and nephews here, but she got sick and had to come. They brought her back up from Florida, sold the house down there. And I walked in, and I'm expecting to see this woman kind of, taking her last breath. She's sitting up reading Red Book magazine. And so I walked in, and I was really shocked because you don't see that too often. I said to her, for someone who's dying, you look pretty alive to me. And she laughed. She goes, oh, Father, I am alive, but I am dying. Come sit down and talk with me. We talked for like an hour and a half. She was as animated as you could be. She talked about her life and her husband and all the wonderful things that had happened to her throughout her life. And so I anointed her, gave her Holy Communion, and I said, awesome, maybe I'll see you tomorrow. Within a half hour after I left, she died. I was like totally blown away because she was so alive. But she did what people will often do at the end. She rallied. She wanted to have her last words put out there for somebody to hear. She wasn't going to leave this world without saying her goodbyes. And it was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life. Now, we have this beautiful experience in the lives of Peter, James, and John today. the Transfiguration. But before we get to that point, we hear from the letter of Peter and then the prophet Daniel at the very beginning. Now, we've heard about Daniel throughout this cycle of the readings this year. Daniel and who was the other guy? Benjamin? Was it Benjamin? No, not Daniel. Anyway, Daniel's one of the great prophets, but he's a prophet that deals with apocalyptic happenings. The prophetic literature proclaims what's going to come. Apocalyptic literature proclaims what's going to come, and if you don't listen, you're going to burn in hell, pretty much. You follow the Lord strictly, or you will pay for it. It's not particularly uplifting. It's meant to frighten. It's meant to shake people. And so apocalyptic literature deals with the end times, what's going to happen, not just in the life of the people of that time, but what's going to happen at the end of life, at the end of the world. So apocalyptic literature becomes very popular in the church's understanding leading up to the Middle Ages. And then it kind of fades out. But in the 17th and the 18th century, as the Christian world is battling with itself, suddenly apocalyptic literature becomes popular again. And it begins to be used as a weapon. So the battle between religions in Europe during the 17th, 18th, and even into the 20th century all stems from apocalyptic literature, because that's when the evangelical movement begins to rise and becomes when the Anabaptists and the Baptists all come. Some of the more conservative Presbyterian churches, they begin to preach fire and brimstone. We've heard of that. And that's what apocalyptic literature becomes, fire and brimstone. But here, Daniel talks about this dream he has. Dreams are a big thing in apocalyptic literature, of this vision of one like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven. And that's foreknowledge of the coming of the Savior, as the church will proclaim later on, after it has been well established. And Daniel is one of those figures that actually is a foreshadowing of Jesus. You see, Daniel goes into the Babylonian exile. The Jewish people have been conquered, and they're taken back to Babylon, not to be punished, but to become Babylonians. It's very much like what the Russians have done with Ukrainian children. They take them out of their family homes, take them back to Russia, erase their past, and give them a new beginning with the knowledge, the understanding that this is going to make them have a better life. But what it really does is supply a young group of people who will later produce Russian children, because the population of Russia has been continually declining since the 1950s. And this is an attempt to renew the population. But for the Babylonians, when they take a nation or a people captive, they take them back, but they plan on sending them back to their native land as good Babylonians. Not as good Jews, but as good Babylonians. But over the ages, they learn, and this is why the Babylonian kingdom at this time is the greatest on earth. You know, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the great wonders of the ancient world, were real. The city because of all this kind of labor, because of all these different cultures coming to Babylon, they learn about architecture and design and mathematics. All of that will eventually find its way into the Roman world and will die away in the ancient world of the Muslim world. They will pick it up later on and become great art. What you see in Rome, if you go to St. Peter's, it's a Romanesque designed building, and it has all these arches. And those arches come from Babylon. The design, how to build them, how to make them last forever. So the Romans were able to build aqueducts that bring water into the city of Rome, even to this day. If you go to the Trevi Fountain and you're really hot and it's like August and you're really thirsty, you're going to go into that fountain and scoop up some water. And it's perfectly clean because it comes from the mountains. And it comes in through those aqueducts that have been around for almost 2,500 years now. That's how developed Babylon was. So that city in the middle of the desert is a shining beacon for their people, but also meant to impress the people that are coming there as slaves to want to be part of that world. Well, the Jewish people, some of them did, and that was a big problem. Some of them did adopt the practices of the Babylonians. Daniel does not. Daniel remains a faithful Jew. And he is gradually promoted within the civil structure of the city, and he becomes one of the satraps. They were like governors. He becomes a governor of the Jewish people, but also a governor of Babylon. He has a civil position in the government. And he does a really good job with it. So the local governors begin to get jealous of him. And they have him, they have the king of Babylon, Darius the king, sign a document that anybody who honors God that's not the God of Babylon should be punished for what they're doing. He incites division. They basically corral the king into doing what they want. And so the king has to punish Daniel when they then accuse him of bringing false gods into Babylon. So what happens? Daniel is thrown to the lions. You might have heard about it. Now, years ago, I went down to the National Gallery in Washington, and I went with another priest, and this priest was a real academic. He was, he was a writer, he was a teacher, a professor. He had worked for the government at one point in his life, but he was a bookworm. He was a real intellectual. And we go there, and we're walking through the gallery, and we come into this huge room. And honest to God, there's a painting about 3/4 the size of that wall in the gallery of Daniel and the lions. And I walked in. I knew exactly what it was as soon as I got there, what the story was about. And I was absolutely amazed. And I'm just looking at this painting with wonder and awe. And Phil, the priest I was with, comes up and he says, "You ready to go?" I'm like, "Phil, look at this painting." He goes, "Yeah, lions. Okay, lions and tigers and bears, oh my. Can we go?" I said, "Look at the painting." I don't see anything. I'm like, this is the academic. This is the guy that's supposed to pick up on these. I said, "Look at Daniel. He's down in the bottom of this pit. And the people that had him thrown into the pit are up at the top, looking with great delight at dinner for the lions. But then when you look at the lions, there's not one lion roaring at Daniel. They're roaring up at the people at the top who threw him into the den. They're defending him. The lion closest to him, it's got its claw out, and it's reaching up. And Daniel's just sitting there kind of watching the whole thing. And it was a beautiful painting because it told the story of how God protects and God defends and God honors. Daniel, because the lions would not eat him, is taken out of that pit. The people that accused him are then put in, and they become lunch. But it's a story about this man who perseveres, who does not give up on his faith, who does not give up on God, because he knows God is not going to give up on him. And he comes out, and so he's telling the people of Babylon and the Jewish people captive in the nation of Babylon, and he is telling them, persevere, hold out, do not doubt God, trust in him at all times and in all seasons, and God will not disappoint you. And eventually, they are sent back to Jerusalem. They go back as Babylonians, but as soon as they get there, they start building the temple again. Because of that faith, because Daniel persevered. And so when we read in the second reading about from St. Peter, Peter is saying that if you go back in your history, if you look back at where you were, you will discover who you are. And he's referencing in his letter that episode of Daniel in the Old Testament. But he's also saying that that episode that happened to Daniel happens again and is fulfilled in the Transfiguration here described in Matthew's Gospel. This experience of God at work through time and history is made absolutely graphic in these stories. Because indeed, that's how God works in our lives. I do a lot of looking into the rearview mirror of my mind these days. Because, my days are getting shorter. And I don't know when my time will come. I'm not in any hurry, mind you. But I don't know when the Lord will call me home. But I know that God has been with me all throughout my life. And when I look back, boy, do I see how clearly God has been there. Because when you're in the midst of crisis or you're in the midst of ecstasy, you're not worried about God and all of this. You're just living in that moment. But later, after you sit down and you've had time to breathe and to think and to reflect, you realize, oh my, there was God all along. And that's what we want to be reminded of today, is that no matter what happens to us, we are God's children. We know where we are going because we know where we have been. We know that our future is foretold, and many of the things that were foretold have come to be. And so we learn to trust, and we learn to depend on God's love. And you would not be here if you hadn't felt that love at some point on your journey. You would not be here if you hadn't already in some way, shape, or form seen the Lord in your life. And those glimpses into the divine are fleeting, just like they were for James and John and Peter. And sometimes, just as James and John and Peter were not prepared for it, we're not always prepared for the grace of God. You know, when Peter says, Lord, it's good that we're here. Let us, I don't know, build some tents, have a party, make a picnic out of it. They don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to respond. Very human experience. When we are wrapped in the divine, we don't know how to respond because it is divine. But when we stop and we look back and we have our wits about her once more, we know because we've experienced the living presence of God. That's why when we have Eucharist, we are reminded of that Last Supper. We are reminded of every Friday night in a Jewish household where you pray because it's Passover. And you are reminded that just as God traveled through the Egyptians and slew the firstborn child of every family in Pharaoh's land, and the people that are spared are the people who washed their doors, their lentils, with the blood of the lamb that they were told to slaughter. Because the blood of the lamb would protect them. The food we share protects us in this world. It feeds us and nourishes us and transforms us a little bit each time we receive it. And as we grow in understanding and hopefully in wisdom as we age, we can see that presence more clearly, and we celebrate it with great joy and great delight, because God is with us even now, in this moment, in this time in our history. God is here to guide us and to save us and to love us beyond all telling. And we keep coming back for more, because every now and then we get a glimpse of the miraculous, and the miraculous changes lives.